Good morning. I'll present Dani Schrire as a lecturer at the Hebrew University with a joint appointment in the program of for folklore and folklore studies and the program in cultural studies. He is currently the chair for the folklore program and the director of the Folklore Research Center. His research addresses folklore theory, history, and practice, namely the work of collecting and archiving everyday life, critical heritage studies, walking as a cultural practice, and postcarding. The latter is carried out in the relation to the David Perlman Holy Land postcard collection, which was recently donated to the Folklore Research Center. His talk today will address intangible heritage and the way folklore archives addresses ephemeral practice and why this has become a key issue in the digital age. So the floor is yours.
תודה, אחמד. שוכרן. Good morning, everybody. I would like to thank also Noah and the organizers of the conference for this invitation, and I'm very happy to be here still in person. As you know, one of the key people in the digitization of the Jerusalem archives was Professor Ronnie Ellenblum, and the last panel, and I do draw your attention to it, is dedicated to his memory, and I would like to dedicate my own talk to his memory as well. Ronnie was my first teacher, and some of the ideas in this paper go back to my master's thesis that he supervised more than 16 years ago. In this context, I should add that I'm unaware of an archive that documented Ronnie's peculiar movements in the city that he loved, notably his cycling habits. But I have to confess that every now and then I see a cyclist whose body posture and determination, if anybody knows what I mean, Ronnie had a very specific way of doing it. But sometimes somebody reminds me of him, and I think it happens to me at least once a week. It is always a happy, sad moment, as you can imagine. The last memory I have of Ronnie was near Balfour Street in a huge demonstration one rainy Saturday evening. He was wearing, nobody's probably ever seen that before, a pink raincoat with victorious hands in the air, and this is the unrecorded image I have in my memory of him. Living memory is a good place to begin because it is very different than an archive. So please consider the wonderful poem by Eugenio Montale, La Memoria, which was translated into English by Ghanshyam Singh. Memory was a literary genre before writing was born. Then it became chronicle and tradition, but it was already stinking like a corpse. Living memory is immemorial. It doesn't arise from the mind, nor sink into it. It clinges to whatever exists like a halo of fog around the head. It has already evaporated, and it's doubtful if it will return. It doesn't always remember itself. So indeed, after the chronicle and tradition, we have the archive, which is even smellier than that, and we are all here as part of a 3-day international conference to discuss Jerusalem archives and urban heritage. Just fancy that. 3 days dedicated to archives in an art and design academy. Perhaps there are people here who disagree, but I suspect that nobody would have organized such a conference in Bצלאל 20 years, let's say, ago. Since heritage discourse always takes place in the present moment, as Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet formulated some time ago, then the present moment is of vital importance. So how come we are now contemplating archives? So the key is the subtitles for the conference that relates to our age, and we can argue about that, but our age is considered the digital age, something we were less sure of 20 years ago. Whenever we change a medium, we reflect on the previous one, so it seems. The current archive renaissance stems from the digital age and the digitization of material that calls our attention to what was archived in the first place, how it was archived and kept, and perhaps the most important question that we do not always pose, why was it archived? With the latter comes another set of questions. What wasn't archived? Why wasn't it archived? And then returning to the how question, how could we archive other types of material? As a folklorist, I'm invested intellectually in what some call folklore archives and others tradition archives. These peculiar archives operate in certain ways that I wish to draw your attention to. They too are undergoing a renaissance and are tied to the heritage discourse. In what follows, I begin with a certain historical or praxeological overview of folklore archives and why they are limited when we try to discuss urban culture. I then relate to how this is connected to the discourse on heritage, namely the heritage of collections and intangible heritage. Following this, I wish to suggest another imagined archive, not totally imagined, an archive of walks, which I use here deliberately to think of what archives can we imagine when discussing the heritage of a city. So let's begin with a certain kind of historical overview of folklore archives. Folklore as a discipline developed in the course of the 19th century following the impact romantic thinkers such as Johann Gottfried Herder made. As modern times became an evident fact, with peasants living to the cities in the course of the 19th century, and as schools formed formats pushed aside oral forms of expression, this counter movement put traditions at its center. Building on the novelty of the times and the charge forward, great concern of what was left behind was expressed. The growing fascination of slow village life, old stories, crafts, and expressions fascinated generations of young, educated men, and I'm afraid they are mostly men. Some belonged to elite circles. They began transcribing songs, stories, proverbs, expressions, documenting harvest traditions, spring carnivals, and so forth. Much ink was spilled over the national bias of this project. Indeed, in contrast to much of the anthropological project that was tied to colonialism, folklore is viewed as promoting a specific idea of romantic nationalism with its own prejudices, anti-Semitism, essentialism, and so on. Accounts that document this legacy focus on the folk of the composed folklore itself introduced by William John Thoms in 1846, but something is lost in these accounts, and that is the lore. In fact, folklore was harnessed to build nations, but also it partook in constructing regional and ethnic identities, as well as feeding colonial and imperial sentiments, not to mention universal admiration of human creativity. In that sense, many folks were imagined in this intellectual projects. I find it much more compelling to think through the lore because the idea that there is a special category of practiced knowledge that we consider to be folklore is particularly intriguing, given that it was a paradoxical endeavor from the start. And why so? So let's look at the most famous, perhaps, folklorists of the 19th century, the Grimm brothers. So they listened to storytellers, let's say telling the story of Rapunzel or Cinderella, and they imagined these stories to be pure manifestations of a communal, simple folk spirit. So amazed were they by these stories that they, of course, had to save them from oblivion. We can imagine that this enthusiasm was connected to the sound of the words uttered, with the intonation and the bodily performance involved. Yet this fascination was transformed by the Grimms, who as educated men used, as they did at the time, a pen to write down the stories, inscribing them on sheets of paper, and as we know, reworking them, editing, correcting, standardizing the German, eventually printing. The Grimms were linguists, so they cared very much about proper German, so they also changed the German. As Richard Bauman and Charles Briggs showed, the Grimms and other folklorists tried to negotiate between provincializing culture and universalizing it at the same time in the processes of purification. On the one hand, such stories were viewed as pure and so in need of salvaging from oblivion. And on the other hand, they had to be transformed into an ontological format addressing new audiences. The same paradox can be observed with the introduction of archival technology, which was mobilized to the folklore cause at different stages, but I think the most famous case is the archives of the Finnish Literature Society, the SKS at Helsinki, in Helsinki, when millions of folk narratives, pictures, and sound recordings are preserved and registered. Traditional archives are different than many other archives in that the materials stored in boxes are a result of a crafted attempt to collect. Now, this innocent word, collect, is reminiscent of the immense impact botany had on folklore studies. Our discipline borrows many other botanical terms. So when a folklorist was sent to collect, and I'm not going to have my hand in the air all the time, but you can imagine that when I use the word collect, I mean it like this, yeah? To collect folklore, you would typically travel far away. Listening to an epic song, you would then write the words down and travel back to Helsinki, where it was stored in a particular box. It was then analyzed and cataloged with small notes stored in tiny cataloging drawers, and there are like thousands there, together with other material from other parts of Finland. All of these immense transformations were carried out with a vocabulary which was completely different. Conservation, preservation, protection, all of these. Until the 70s, folklore archives were the core of the discipline, as each archive was the hub of a network of collectors, researchers, and archivists. However, by the early 70s, a revolution swept the discipline with new perspectives that were introduced to the study of folklore, this time focusing on the immediate performance and interaction between performers, like the storytellers, let's say, and the audience. As in performance studies, which developed at the same time, any document or recording that tried freezing a moment became suspect, and folklore archives were heavily criticized as a wrong way of doing folklore studies. However, in the past 10, perhaps 20 years, things gradually changed. Digitization opportunities geared new interest, as suddenly archives could be opened to the public. As we know here, digitization calls for a reflection on the history of an archive and the intellectual assumptions that governed the collection to begin with. But this is only half of the story. The new interest in these archives has to do also with the growing heritage industry. Ever since the UNESCO efforts in North Sudan and the ratification of the World Heritage Convention of 1972, 50 years ago, heritage related to sites, natural or cultural or both. Heritage was then chiefly the business of architects, quite a few here, art historians, archaeologists, all of whom took part in what Laura Jane Smith called Authorized Heritage Discourse, or AHD. 20 years later, the UNESCO established the Memory of the World program, which promotes the documentary heritage by facilitating techniques of preservation, increasing accessibility and awareness to the significance of archives and manuscripts. Some folklore archives appear in this prestigious list of Memory of the World. So in Israel, for example, in addition to the Yad Vashem testimonials, which are listed there, also the Dov Noi Israel Folktale archives are part of the Memory of the World. So how can we relate to oral stories that were then documented on paper as memories? In what way? Should we also remember the intonation? Should we also document the voices? Is the word memory, which we encountered in Montale's poem already, is it just a metaphor? Indeed, as Montale made clear, living memory is something else other than documentary heritage. In the UNESCO, living memory is often attributed to a different kind of list and convention, one from the 21st century, the Intangible Heritage Convention, Israel being one of the few countries that never ratified this agreement. Intangible heritage relates to the way we know things before writing was born. The history of this convention is tied to some objections posed by countries from Japan to South America, as the Icelandic folklorist Valdimar Hafstein shows in his book on, and also in his documentary film, which I highly suggest, Flight of the Condor. In a sense, the history of intangible heritage is tied to ideas that rebelled against the thought that only grandeur buildings are important, and in that sense, many countries in the global south played a seminal role in promoting it. In contrast to the 1972 list of sites and the 1992 Memory of the World program, which highlights specific repositories of documents, intangible heritage may cross borders as it relates to the actual practice of doing things that mattered. Dancing, singing, cooking, bathing, crafting, building, eating, playing, growing, hunting, making, all such verbs. Some practices are tied to a specific place, such as the cultural space of the Jumea Al-Fna Square in Marrakesh, or Seto Lelo, a polyphonic singing tradition of the Seto in the small southeastern corner of Estonia. Alternatively, some practices are national, like Finnish sauna traditions or the French gastronomic meal. But it can also be transnational, as in the one of the latest additions to the list, which I'm a bit shocked that it's only now entered the list, proposed by 16 countries that include Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Palestine, Arabic calligraphy, knowledge, skills, and practices. Occasionally, traditions can be international without even common languages or boundaries, such as the falconry traditions, with the birds, the falcons, that were proposed by 24 countries from Austria, France, United Arab Emirates, Mongolia, up to Korea. Okay? So intangible heritage became a very important resource and investment for folklorists. After years of studying and publishing works on singing traditions and crafts, and and after archiving such lore, could now connect to the growing heritage industry. Academic folklorists also learned how to work with and not against this industry after many years of suspicion. So where does this locate tradition archives? In the memory of the world list or in the intangible list? Or perhaps these are not mutually exclusive, as the very idea of lists entail. Tradition archives are based on registering certain practices or on identifying those practices that one wants to archive to begin with. And so the strength of these archives lies in the way they draw attention to some creative aspects. In other words, and maybe to some it is counterintuitive, material is archived not because a priori it is valuable, in my opinion at least. Rather, the very act of archiving material in a folklore archive declares its importance. So when archives contain lists of ballads, they draw attention to the importance of the lyrics of these performances. But it may eventually misrepresent their musicality or traditions that are related to how it was performed. Of course, it is not a static situation. To a certain degree, scholars have recognized the way an archive transforms culture, all the while rhetorically relating to the way it conserves it. That's why they widened the scope of archived material, and with new technologies of recordings and filming, they expanded the type of material. Nevertheless, there are constant biases that characterize these archives and some lacunae that I wish to highlight in the context of our conference. Yeah. So first, folklore archives traditionally focus on the hinterland, refraining from examination of city life. Folklore was searched for among those who were viewed as non-moderns. Drawing on the romantic tradition, folklore was collected among peasants and those living in remote areas far from cities. This also meant that culture that was considered urban was not always collected. Second, ideal subjects consisted of those who were illiterate, whose knowledge was passed through mimicry or from mouth to ear or hand to hand. Preferably, older people with a bias towards women who represented something more local and domestic and detached from the great world. And in some cases, also very young children who were not contaminated, so to say, by modernity. Third, specific genres of knowledge types were preferred. The identification of stable folk genres such as, let's say, legends or fables reaches beyond the scope of our meeting. But suffice to note that when scholars or local intellectuals collected material for the archive, they typically went with very strict instructions or questionnaires that informed them of what sort of lore to collect. Prioritization reflected the interests of a community of scholars, sometimes the international community, and not necessarily what locals cherished. As we digitize such archives today, and this is a global phenomenon, we become aware of all these biases because the archive represents certain ideologies as to what folklore was considered to denote many decades ago. We realize that such archives represent two cultures in dialogue, that from which the material was gathered from, and that of those who decided upon what to collect. For this very reason, we know that folklore is inseparable from the folklorists who designated the scope of this term. I've mentioned William John Thoms, if you recall, who coined the term folklore. And as Jonathan Roper notes, he also coined the word folklorists. So this is not a new state of affairs. From the beginning, it was the same. Before we continue, please let me summarize the route I've been taking in the past 20 or so minutes. I set off from the present, our digital age, and the idea of heritage, which makes us reconsider what was archived, how, and why. I then discussed the history and practice of folklore studies, and particularly the establishment of folklore archives. I then considered briefly the difference between archival heritage and intangible heritage mentioned in the UNESCO initiatives. This allowed us to consider some of the biases of folklore archives. Speaking to historians or architects, it was important for me to present you with these questions in history because there is so much urban know-how that we hardly consider just because it did not enter the archive and cannot be digitized or heritagized. This brings me to an idea I've been toying with for a few years now, a walking archive. When I first presented the idea in a panel of scholars of walking, I could feel the discomfort in the air that was actually explicitly expressed. Over the years, some scholars of walking became more tolerant to it. For those of you unfamiliar with walking scholarship, I should say, there are countless publications that explore walking as a cultural practice. They typically are very apologetic about it. It's a very strange thing, but you know, there are so many works out there right now, so I don't think I think it's kind of ridiculous by now. Anyway, the assumed strangeness of the topic stems from the fact that studying walking is about transforming embodied forms of knowledge to textual format. But for this very reason, many of us find it so compelling as it pushes us to think creatively on how to study culture in the constraints of academic forms of communication. The tension between textual knowledge and embodied forms of knowledge is at the core of the classic text of Michel de Certeau, The Practice of Everyday Life. It began as a 2-volume project which blends theory and practice, yet this is not always acknowledged, even if we consider the fact that the second volume was carried out mostly by de Certeau's students. Very few actually examine it. Those who come across with the first volume typically read one chapter, Walking in the City, which came to epitomize the entire project. In this chapter, de Certeau begins with a view of New York City from the observation deck on top of one of the Twin Towers. It was written in the 80s. He counters the optic knowledge of the city of the one who reads the city as a text with the embodied knowledge of the walker beneath. The walker writes the text. Yet if we examine the book, then the everyday seems to evolve not only as an embodied vis-a-vis optic knowledge, but also as running between textual knowledge and embodied knowledge, where reading, for example, can be contrasted to writing. De Certeau was a Jesuit, built upon an established dichotomy between the walker, the Wandersmann by Silesius, one of the key thinkers in the Middle Ages, and the one who knows by reading or seeing. This returns to some core ideas already presented in the Gospels, discussed by the Church Father and other theologians, but can be compared to ideas in Hasidism and Buddhist traditions. As Charles Locke shows in his discussion of this essay by de Certeau, the idea of climbing to a high point in order to know is culturally conditioned. I mean, think of yourself when you go to a city. In many cases, you know, the first thing we do is travel. We climb a huge flight of stairs to see the city, to grasp it. As an example, he discusses the tallest structure in Europe for 500 years, the spire of the Cathedral of Salisbury in South England. I don't know if you ever visited it. It's wonderful, the cathedral with the Magna Carta and a lot of other goodies. Apparently, there isn't a single pictorial or textual description of the view from on top, the entire Middle Ages. So people climbed up to the spire and never wrote about it. With secularization of space, the scopic became more dominant, and perhaps the best example is the climb of Petrarca to Mont Ventoux. But as we could see yesterday in the keynote, some digital tools use photographs from above, stressing the scopic aspects of knowing a place. So, I mean, this is very dominant today. In this context, the idea of a walking archive, which may seem as an oxymoron, targets the perceived dichotomy between embodied knowledge and other knowledge formats. As we could see from my historical review, there is nothing new about transforming intangible knowledge and the establishment of archives, despite the 2 lists by the UNESCO. Clearly, city archives contain a range of texts, committee decisions, regulations, discussions, maps, etc., and also lots of optic knowledge, drawings, photographs, etc. Any archive is based on transformations. Say, and this goes back to, I mean, the evolution of perspective, you know, from 3D to 2D. And as we could see also yesterday, in the digital age, what we see is reversed. You know, we have 2D, like documents or photographs that are then transferred to 3D models or 3D. Yeah, with VI, you know, exactly. We transform, but you can think of other aspects, and we have the other city. We have the other city engineer. I mean, we can think of an irritated administrator who must have used horrendous words in some discussions, and that happens every now and then, even in respectable places. And these words do not appear then in the document. Okay? Rarely they do. I mean, I don't think so. Or on official letters, we get all of these is censored when we write a normal kind of summary of what was going on in the discussion. So folklorists who documented swear words, for example, or sexual jokes, were always interested in this subterranean part of culture. What the Chilean, Mexican, Spanish author Roberto Bolaño and his fellow poets would have considered infra-realism. So whereas some archives document the realities of a city, and those who engage propose architectural plans and dreams that were never realized, or mystic imagination in case of Jerusalem, this is very crucial, can be considered even above reality or surreal, then a walking archive is part of infrarealism, all a part of city heritage. Few walks in Jerusalem have left some marks. So consider the footsteps of Christ, a strange form of acheropoieta, okay, like an image not made by human hands. Yet most of us walkers end without leaving a trace. In that sense, they are the same as most folk performances, those who sit and tell a story or dance or sing. Yet that never stopped folklorists from documenting them. Of course, much is lost in this transformative act, but new meanings emerges. You may claim that it is impossible to document a walk. After all, what can you say about your own walks? Most of us lack the right words for that. Is that so? So I'm going to give you two counterexamples from the past year of two amazing MA theses that were written at the Cultural Studies program. The first one was by Daniela Zeltzer, who engaged the works of Haredi women, ultra-Orthodox women. She interviewed those Haredi women who left religion or those who became Haredi, יוצאות בשאלה וחוזרות בתשובה, asking them to discuss their works. She assumed that those who underwent profound change in their lifestyles would discuss habits that typically go under the radar. Indeed, her interlocutors had much to say about their walking bodies. They drew attention to specific bodily aspects as well as to embodied forms of religiosity and piety. Zeltzer then ventured further afield, interviewing actresses who portrayed Haredi women, for example, in Shlisel, asking them to discuss what it meant walking as a Haredi. Here again, these actresses who teach in acting and dancing schools had a vast range of professional jargon to discuss where every body part is supposed to be situated, what flat shoes do to the gait, and so on. By juxtaposing these two sets of talks about walks, Zeltzer was able to portray something elusive as Haredi women walking. This know-how can be documented if we consider Jerusalem's Haredi neighborhoods and beyond, where many such walks take place. These are all part, in my mind, of the intangible heritage of the city. It may seem mundane, but Zeltzer's thesis showed how rich, intricate, and meaningful this form of performative knowledge is. In the course of 2020-2021, many political demonstrations swept the city. Jerusalem is a city that knew many marches before, and some of these are indeed documented. Think of General Allenby, for example. None were as documented in my mind as these marches, which were photographed, recorded, sound recordings, uploaded to social media. I personally participated in some of these marches, and we all learned how to march. There was a lot of learning there. In Sphira Alison Stern's thesis, she interviewed choreographers and dancers to discuss these demonstrations and such marches. In fact, her interviews shed light on the entire first year of the COVID, as very few commentators did, attending to the meaning of movement and lack thereof and its impact on urban culture. Stern is herself a dancer, choreographer, and activist in Jerusalem, and she too managed to bring this intangible knowledge to paper. The COVID year undoubtedly creates new forms of urban culture and walking habits that her thesis uncovers. Zeltzer and Stern show in their own ways how it is possible to document walks. This infrarealism does not stop here, and it is also part of lofty imaginations of the city. Writers have this gift of bringing culture to life on paper. Consider Shai Agnon's Small Shlishon, only yesterday, which includes 2 chapters of Balak's Flannery. Balak is a dog who plays a crucial part in this literary masterpiece, but his frantic ramblings through the city are a source of knowledge that tells us how Agnon experienced intimately how he experienced Jerusalem, at least some 70 years ago, and how the city might have been experienced by him, at least in his imagination of a walking dog. And I think it's one of the most brilliant manifestations of how Jerusalem city, or how it was experienced 70 or 80 years ago. Another author, Chaim Azaz, together with my colleague Tom Fogel and with the cooperation of Gil Weisblei, the director of the Chaim Azaz Memorial Foundation, we are now beginning a project that examines his diaries. Apparently, Azaz kept note of his interactions and moves in the city, interviewing people from different communities, namely the Yemenite Jews from Sana, but also everyday experiences. His archive is like a folklore archive, but one which is a lot more intuitive and offers vast opportunities to explore the heritage of the city. His documentation, like sometimes he would, let's say, couple on a bench, he would write down what they're saying to each other and how they're sitting and what they do. And he's a writer, he knows how to do that. So his documentation infiltrated his own novels, but most of it was never examined, although Hazaz had an eye for detail as he registered his encounters on the streets. So to conclude, I'm not sure if it's a conclusion, historical knowledge is very much tied to the archive, but there was a time when historical practice of knowing the past was based on the act of walking. In a very recent article by Paul Reedman published in History, the Journal of the Historical Association, he tells of how walking was part of the way antiquarians since the 18th century knew the past. They emphasized embodied understanding of history. This form of knowledge did not end. We still take schools on hikes in which young pupils use the feet to know. The well-documented history of the Israeli tiyul was incredibly influential pedagogically. As we contemplate digitization, I hate this word, we should remember that in any case, we are transforming knowledge. When we take embodied knowledge and transform it into paper, when we take paper notes and turn them into digital interactive platforms, as we saw yesterday, when we relive or re-embody papers, or when we combine embodied practices with other mediations, in any case, we transform. To transform means that values change. Some disappear from our attention and others are added. In each and every instance, we make decisions that impact our environment and other people. And this is a responsibility we all have. Jerusalem specifically, between the surreal, the lived city, and the infrareal, is perhaps the best example to think about in ethical ways. So to transform, to make a difference, calls for responsibility, and I think that in our case, a lot of it. Thank you.